What do you do when you find something true and dangerous? Not dangerous in the abstract, dangerous in the specific sense that if the right people hear about it, your life changes in ways you cannot predict and cannot take back. When you have a thing in your hands and you understand what it is, and you understand what it would cost you, and you have to decide what to do with it before morning. I've spent enough time with this man's letters to tell you what that night looked like. The year was 1675. The city was The Hague. A philosopher named Baruch Spinoza, 42 years old, working as a lens grinder in a rented room, had just come back from Amsterdam. He had gone there to publish a book he had been writing in secret for 15 years. He had spent 15 years of his life grinding lenses to pay the rent, writing in the evenings and sometimes through the night, circulating pages to a small circle of trusted friends, revising. 15 years. He went to Amsterdam to finally put the manuscript in the hands of his printer. He came back without doing it. And what he did next, in the months after that return, in the quiet of his room in The Hague, was more deliberate and more calculated than anything he had done in those 15 years of writing. He made arrangements, precise arrangements, the kind you make when you understand that you are working inside a window of time that will close. I need you to understand what he had built, not the philosophy in the abstract, what he had actually assembled piece by piece, working through sources most scholars of his era had read without reading carefully, because that is the part the title of this video promises you, the decoding. And the decoding is real, it's specific, and it's not what most people think it is. When people hear that Spinoza decoded a banned gospel, they imagine him finding a lost manuscript, a hidden codex in some archive, a document that had been locked away and that he somehow got his hands on. That is not what happened. What happened is more interesting and more methodologically sophisticated than a manuscript discovery. Spinoza read the men who had done the suppressing. He understood something that most historians miss. If you want to know what the church erased, don't look for what's absent. Look at what the church fathers wrote when they were attacking heretics. Look at the condemnations. Look at the catalogues of error. Because every time a church father quoted a text in order to condemn it, he preserved it. Origen condemned the gospel of the Hebrews. Jerome described it in detail. Epiphanius catalogued the Ebionite gospel. They were trying to destroy ideas by naming them, and in naming them they kept them alive. Spinoza understood this. The Tractatus Theologico-Politicus, published in 1670, is built on this method. Read the text as a human document. Read it against the grain of what the institution wants you to find in it. Strip away the interpretive apparatus that tells you what you are and are not allowed to conclude. Applied to the condemnations of the church fathers, this method becomes a kind of forensic reconstruction. If you want to know what a banned text said, read the bishop who banned it. He will tell you, in order to explain why it was wrong. He will quote it precisely enough for you to reconstruct it. The negative space of suppression is itself a document. Now let me show you what Spinoza found in that negative space. Origen of Alexandria, writing in the 3rd century, compiled a massive commentary on the Gospel of John. In the process, he quoted extensively from a text he called the Gospel of the Hebrews. This was the gospel of the first generation of Jewish Christians in Jerusalem. Not the Gentile communities Paul had founded, the original community. The people who had known Jesus, who spoke his language, who buried their dead in his city. It described the baptism of Jesus differently. In the Gospel of the Hebrews, as Origen preserved it, the Holy Spirit descends upon Jesus at the Jordan River, and Jesus becomes the Son of God in that moment. Not from birth, not from eternity. At the baptism, he was a man. He became divine at the river. That is what the original Jerusalem community believed. Jerome, writing in approximately 393 AD in a text called De Viris Illustribus, a catalogue of distinguished men, described the Gospel of the Hebrews directly and at length. He is precise about it. He notes that Jesus did not have the divine nature from birth, but received it at the moment of his anointing. The word Christ, Jerome understood, means anointed. Jesus was anointed at the baptism and became the Christ at that moment. Before the baptism, he was a man. After the baptism, he was something else. This is called adoptionism, the theology of adoption. God adopted Jesus at the baptism. Jesus did not exist before his birth as a divine being. He was not present at creation. He was born in Bethlehem as a man, grew up in Nazareth as a man, went to the Jordan River as a man, and at the Jordan something happened that changed what he was. Epiphanius of Salamis, writing his Panarion between 374 and 377 AD, compiled a comprehensive catalogue of heresies. In the section on the Ebionites, the Jewish Christians who observed the law of Moses and believed in the adoptionist Jesus of the Gospel of the Hebrews, Epiphanius preserved a fragment of their gospel, a single sentence, 12 words, a sentence he quoted in order to destroy it. Jesus said, "I am come to abolish the sacrifices, not to fulfill the sacrifices, not to be the final sacrifice, not to complete the system of atonement that the temple priesthood administered and that the entire architecture of Levitical law was built around. To abolish it, to end it, to say that the sacrifices were not the point and never were." 12 words that unmake the entire theology of atonement. If Jesus came to abolish the sacrifices, then the crucifixion was not a sacrifice, it was an execution, and the interpretation that turned the execution into a cosmic payment for human sin was not something Jesus taught. It was something that came after, built on top, imposed on top of a story that, in its original telling, said nothing of the kind. Epiphanius knew this. He quoted the sentence precisely because he needed to name it in order to condemn it, and in naming it, he preserved it. 16 centuries later, Spinoza, working through exactly this kind of patristic source material, had access to both pieces, the original Jerusalem community's gospel and the fragment of their Jesus who came not to complete the sacrificial system, but to end it. These two sources were not secret in Spinoza's era. They were available. They were in libraries. They were in the patristic literature that any educated man of the 17th century could access. But no one had brought them together in the way Spinoza brought them together. No one had read the condemnations as evidence. No one had used the methodical forensic approach of the Tractatus to reconstruct what the suppressed texts actually said. Spinoza did. And what he had by the end of the 1660s was not a single discovery. It was 3 lines of evidence converging on the same conclusion from completely different directions. The first line was the one he published in 1670. The Tractatus Theologico-Politicus, the canonical Gospels, read as human documents. Different authors, different communities, different concerns, different theologies. Matthew's Jesus is a Jewish teacher fulfilling the law. Mark's Jesus is an urgency, a power moving through a world about to end. John's Jesus is a cosmic figure, speaking in long theological monologues that sound nothing like the parables in the other Gospels. These are not complementary accounts of the same man. They are different texts, written at different times by different hands, for different communities, with different theological goals. Spinoza did not say this as a shocking revelation. He said it as a methodological observation. Read the text as a human document. Ask who wrote it, when, for whom, and why. Those questions, applied rigorously, produce an answer the institution could not accept. The canon was assembled from human materials by human beings with human purposes. The second line was what he found in the condemnations, the Gospel of the Hebrews, reconstructed through Origen and Jerome, the Ebionite fragment preserved by Epiphanius, a Jesus who was adopted at the baptism, not born divine, a Jesus who came to abolish the sacrifices, not to be the final one, a Jesus whose community was in Jerusalem, spoke Aramaic, observed the law of Moses, and was eventually driven out of the emerging Christian mainstream for believing what the first disciples had believed. The third line was the ethics. 15 years of geometric argument, built proposition by proposition the way Euclid built geometry, arriving at a God who was not a person, not a being who planned and grieved and made decisions and could be appeased. Not the God of Genesis 6:6 who repented that he had made man on the earth. The God of the ethics was infinite substance, natura, naturans, the ground of all being, from which all things followed with mathematical necessity. Not a being who adopted a son at a river in Galilee, not a being who required sacrifice, not a being who could be angry and appeased and prayed to and spoken for by men with institutional authority. When you put those three lines of evidence together, you have something that no single piece could provide alone. The canonical Gospels, read as human documents, show you a tradition already in conflict with itself. The suppressed texts, reconstructed from the condemnations, show you an earlier tradition with a different Jesus. The ethics shows you a God incompatible with the personal deity the entire tradition was built around. Three independent lines, assembled by one mind working in secret in a rented room in the Dutch Republic, converging on a single conclusion. The Christianity that had been preached from pulpits across Europe for 16 centuries was a construction, not a revelation, a construction, built from human materials, by human hands, with human purposes. He knew what he had. Amsterdam, summer of 1675. Spinoza traveled from The Hague with the ethics complete. 15 years of work. He went to see Jan Rueverts, the printer and bookseller who had published the Tractatus anonymously 5 years earlier. He was ready, the manuscript was ready, the moment was finally there. He did not publish. The reason is documented in a letter. Letter 68, written to Henry Oldenburg, the secretary of the Royal Society of London. Oldenburg was a correspondent Spinoza trusted, a man of scientific temper who understood the importance of the work and had been waiting for years to see the ethics appear. And Spinoza wrote to him to explain what had happened. The letter exists. The words are his. He wrote, "While I was preparing to send to your friend what I promised, a rumor gained currency everywhere that a book of mine about God was in the press, and that in it I endeavor to show that there is no God. This rumor was believed by many. Hence, certain theologians who may have started this rumor took occasion to complain of me before the prince and the magistrates. Moreover, the stupid Cartesians, being suspected of favoring my opinions, attempted to remove the suspicion by abusing everywhere my opinions and writings. When I learned all this from trustworthy men who also told me that the theologians were everywhere plotting against me, I decided to postpone the publication I was preparing." He postponed the publication I was preparing. Read that again. Not cancelled, postponed. He was not giving up on the work. He was responding to a specific tactical situation with the precision of a man who understood that the window for publication would not come while he was alive but might come after. He was 42 years old in 1675. He had been ill for years. He ground lenses in a room full of glass dust, and the glass dust was settling into his lungs. He was not well. He probably knew, in the way that people who pay close attention to their own bodies know things the doctors haven't yet confirmed, that he would not have a long life ahead of him. The question became not whether to publish, but how to arrange for the truth to survive without him. What he built in the months after Amsterdam was not a will in the legal sense. Spinoza had almost no property. A man who lived on lens-grinding wages and a small pension from a patron had nothing to bequeath in the conventional sense. What he built was a chain of custody, a deliberate, carefully constructed arrangement of people who would carry the work forward when he could not. Jan Rueverts would do the actual printing and distribution. He had already proven willing with the Tractatus in 1670. He understood the risk and had done it once. He would do it again, carefully, after the author was beyond the reach of the theologians and the magistrates. Járik Jeles would finance the publication. Jeles was a retired merchant, a devoted member of Spinoza's circle, a man of quiet faith in the importance of what his friend had spent his life building. He would not see a return on the investment. That was not the point. Lodewijk Meyer was the philosophical mind of the circle, a physician and philosopher who had already published his own work and understood the intellectual stakes. He would edit. He would ensure the text went out as Spinoza had written it, not as someone else's revision or softening. Georg Hermann Schuller was the young physician who attended Spinoza in his final months. A German, newly arrived in the Dutch Republic, who had attached himself to Spinoza's orbit with the intensity of a young man who understands he is in the presence of something rare. Schuller would be present at the end. He would be the one to notify Leibniz in November of 1677 that the printing was complete. And Hendrik van der Speyk, Spinoza's landlord, the man who actually owned the house where Spinoza rented a room in The Hague. Van der Spijk had standing instructions. If anything happened, the writing desk in the upstairs room was to go immediately to Amsterdam, to reverse everything in it, untouched, the writing desk. That was the dead man's switch. Van der Spijk would not need to understand the manuscripts, would not need to read them or evaluate them, or make any decision about their content. He would simply need to send the desk to Amsterdam when the time came, and the desk would carry the manuscripts to the people who knew what to do with them. Spinoza had calculated the entire chain. He had chosen each person for a specific function. The chain had redundancy built into it, the way a philosopher builds arguments, anticipating objections, accounting for weak points, making the structure strong enough to hold without the builder. He was going to die and he knew it, and he arranged for the truth to outlive him by building a structure that did not require him to still be alive to function. I need to tell you something personal here. I need to tell you about my sister coming to visit. She drove up from Chattanooga on a Saturday in early October, maybe 4 years ago now. She brought a pound cake. That is what she does. When she is worried about you and doesn't know how to say it directly, she bakes. She brought the pound cake and she came inside, and she sat in my living room, and we talked about the usual things for a while, and then she asked if she could see the office. I showed her the office. The desk was covered. I was deep in the Spinoza correspondence at that point. Letters printed from academic archives, the English translation of the Opera Posthuma open on the desk, notes in my own handwriting on legal pad sheets, some of them taped to the wall with masking tape because I had run out of desk space, the names of the circle written on an index card and pinned next to the window: Ruverts, Yelles, Meyer, Schuller, Van der Spijk. My sister stood in the doorway for a moment looking at all of it. She didn't say anything right away. She is a patient woman. She let the room speak for itself. Then she asked me, and she asked it quietly, if I ever worried about what happened after. She meant after death. She meant judgment. She meant the afterlife we had both grown up believing in with absolute certainty. She meant the question that had organized her entire life, and that, since my wife died, she had suspected had stopped organizing mine. I told her yes. I do worry about what happens after. She looked relieved for exactly 1 second. I told her that what I worry about is dying with things I haven't said, with things I've found and haven't shared, with the work not done. That's what after means to me now. Not judgment, the unfinished sentence, the manuscript in the desk that no one knows to send to Amsterdam. She left earlier than she had planned. I don't blame her. She had driven 2.5 hours with a pound cake, and I was telling her my deepest fear was an unpublished manuscript. That was not the answer she needed. I stood at the window and watched her car back out of the driveway and turn onto the street and disappear. I stood there for a while, the October light in the trees, the quiet of a Saturday afternoon after someone you love has just left because the conversation went somewhere she couldn't follow. Then I went back to the desk. I opened the file of Spinoza's correspondence. I read letter 68 again. The words about the rumor spreading in Amsterdam, the theologians plotting, the decision to postpone, the careful, controlled language of a man who had thought through every word before he wrote it. He made the same choice I make every time I sit down at this desk. To do the work anyway, to build the structure for the truth to survive. The scales were not the same. I am a retired history teacher in Tennessee. He was a philosopher whose arguments would shape Kant and the entire modern tradition of critical thought. What it cost him and what it costs me are not in the same category. But the choice itself, that part is the same. To keep working when the people you love most would prefer you stopped. To say that truth matters more than the comfort of leaving it unexamined. To sit back down at the desk. He sat back down. Every time. For 15 years. Now let me tell you what almost didn't survive. Think about the chain as Spinoza had built it. 5 links: Van der Spijk, Ruverts, Yelles, Meyer, Schuller. Each link had to hold. Each person had to follow through. In the months after Spinoza's death, in 1677 in the Dutch Republic, publishing anything associated with a man who had been called the most pestilential thinker of the age, whose tractatus had been banned across multiple countries, whose name alone was enough to get sermons preached against you from pulpits in Amsterdam and Rotterdam, carrying out that plan required something more than good intentions. It required the willingness to act under actual risk. Van der Spijk, A landlord, not a philosopher, not a member of any intellectual circle, a man who rented rooms and managed a property in The Hague. He had been given instructions by his tenant. When the tenant died, he followed them. He sent the writing desk to Amsterdam. If he had hesitated, if he had thought about the risk to his own reputation, his own business, the relationships he needed with other people in The Hague, if he had opened the desk and looked at the manuscripts and decided that the safer course was to burn them quietly in the fireplace, he would not have been wrong to think that. He would have been cautious, he would have been protecting himself, and the ethics would not exist. The chain held. Ruverts received the desk. Meyer went to work editing. Yelles committed the money. Schuller remained in contact, monitoring, carrying messages. They published the Opera Posthuma, the posthumous works, in the second half of 1677. In secret, without the author's name on the cover, using only his initials. BDS Baruch Spinoza. The initials, not the name, because the name alone would have brought the authorities down on the printer before the ink dried. Schuller wrote to Leibniz in November of 1677 to say the printing was complete. Leibniz, who had met Spinoza in 1676, just months before his death, spent years afterward keeping his distance publicly. The association was that dangerous, but the circle published. They moved fast. Spinoza died in February 1677. The Opera Posthuma appeared before the end of the same year. Less than a year between the death and the publication. They knew that time mattered. They knew that if they moved slowly, if they hesitated, if they let months turn into years, the moment would close. Someone would talk. The authorities would learn what was being planned. The manuscripts would be confiscated. They did not hesitate. They moved with the speed of people who understood that the window was open and would not stay open. In less than a year, the ethics was in the world. What that meant in practice, Hume read Spinoza. Kant could not have written the Critique of Pure Reason without the groundwork Spinoza had laid. The entire tradition of higher biblical criticism, the discipline that reads the Bible as a human document produced by human communities at specific historical moments, descends directly from the Tractatus Theologico-Politicus. Every modern scholar who treats the Gospels as documents to be analyzed rather than sacred texts to be defended is working in a tradition Spinoza established in 1670. If the chain had failed, if van der Speyk had opened the desk and burned the manuscripts rather than send them to Amsterdam, if Ruverts had lost his nerve, if Yelles had been unwilling to commit the money, none of that follows. Not Kant as Kant exists, not the Enlightenment as it happened, not modern biblical scholarship as a discipline. What survived 1677 was not just a philosophy. It was a particular set of questions about how to read a text, how to think about God, how to evaluate claims of authority. Questions Spinoza had arranged to outlive him with the deliberate precision of a man who understood what was at stake. And here is where I want to end. Not with indignation, not with the drama of suppression or the shock of what was hidden. I have spent enough time in this man's letters to know that he was not an angry man. He was a clear man. There is a difference. He was a man who understood precisely what he was doing and accepted precisely what it would cost him and made his arrangements accordingly. He could have kept the ethics to himself, circulated it quietly in manuscript among the circle, never quite printed, never quite public. He could have done that. It would have been safer. He could have burned it. A man who lived on a lens grinder's income, already excommunicated, who had already published one book that got him condemned from pulpits across the Netherlands, who was ill and knew it, could reasonably have decided the world was not going to receive this work and that it was better destroyed than confiscated. He could have made that calculation. He would not have been wrong. He did neither. He built the structure, he assigned the tasks. He gave van der Speyk instructions about the desk. He trusted Ruverts. He believed that Yelles would pay and Meyer would edit and Schuller would stay in contact and the circle would hold. He trusted that the truth could wait, not indefinitely, not without arrangement, but with the right arrangement, with the right people, with the right instructions left in the right place, the truth could survive the man who had found it and arrive in the world when the man himself could no longer be punished for it. I've read his letters. I've read his instructions. The man knew exactly what he was doing. He was not hoping the work would survive. He was engineering its survival. Every person in the chain was chosen deliberately. Every instruction was given with precision. He died in February 1677 at 44, with the glass dust in his lungs, and the manuscript in the desk and Van der Spijk knowing what to do. What survived was not just a book. It was a decision. The decision that truth has a claim on the future, even when you cannot defend it yourself. That if you have built the argument correctly, if you have documented the evidence, if you have chosen the right people and given them the right instructions, the work will reach the world you will not live to see. Spinoza made that decision in the months after Amsterdam, after the rumor spread and the theologians preached and the magistrates were consulted. He went back to the Hague. He wrote to Oldenburg. He made his arrangements. The chain held. The ethics arrived. Kant followed. The discipline that reads the Bible as a human document followed. Everything that depended on those questions being asked in public, without the man who asked them being present to be punished for it, followed. Because one man in 1675, in a rented room in The Hague, calculated that the truth could outlive him if he arranged things carefully enough. He was right. Make of that what you will.